Sarah Caldwell, 28 years old, stepped off the stagecoach with a heart full of hope and a suitcase full of letters. The air in New Mexico territory was dry, sharp around the edges, and carried none of the softness she'd known in Virginia. She adjusted her bonnet and scanned the dusty horizon, expecting to see Henry Wycliffe waiting with open arms and a tired smile. He had promised to meet her himself, promised to walk her across the porch of the house he built with his own hands, promised to marry her before the summer heat got too cruel. But Henry wasn't there. Instead, 3 men stood near the feed store, leaning against a rail like they'd been waiting. One of them, a tall man with a sun-split hat and a smirk he didn't bother to hide, stepped forward. "Miss Caldwell?" he asked. She nodded, clutching her case tighter. "Yes. Are you with Mr. Wycliffe?" The man tipped his hat in a way that felt more rehearsed than respectful. "Sure am. Henry sent us to fetch you. Said he's caught up with ranch business, but we're to get you to him by sundown." Sarah hesitated, just long enough to feel the twist in her stomach. She studied the other 2, silent, mean-eyed, with the look of men who'd never learned patience or kindness. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to the channel for more real, raw stories just like this. Still, she climbed into the wagon. What else was she to do? Turn back, ride alone, into unfamiliar land? Henry was her future, her way out of small-town Virginia, and a life lived half asleep. She told herself the men were just roughened by work, not cruelty. The wagon rolled out of town, kicking up a wake of dust. The road was unmarked, winding away from the main trail and into a stretch of open country that looked like God had forgotten to finish it. Scrub brush, broken stone, a dry riverbed that hadn't seen water since spring. She tried small talk, asked about the ranch, about Henry. None of the men answered. Miles passed in silence. Then the tall one looked back at her, eyes flat as glass. "Best get some rest, Miss Caldwell," he said. "You got a long night ahead." She didn't understand what he meant. Not then. But something in his voice made her spine go rigid. She turned her face toward the horizon, searching for the promise of a white fence or chimney smoke. There was nothing. The sun dipped low. The wind picked up, tugging her bonnet loose. And somewhere deep inside her, Sarah Caldwell began to feel the first flickers of fear. Not because she was alone with 3 strangers in the wilderness, but because she realized she wasn't alone by accident. She was alone by design. Sarah woke to the sound of the wagon creaking to a stop. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the desert floor, stretching the men's figures into giants. One of them jumped down and tied the reins to a mesquite tree that had no business growing out here, dry and twisted like everything else in this God-forsaken place. She sat up straighter, her voice tight. "Is this the ranch?" The tall one looked at her without smiling. "End of the line." The others said nothing. Just climbed down from the wagon and pulled her case from the back like it weighed nothing. They tossed it onto the ground, and the latch snapped open. Her dresses spilled out like broken promises. The red one, Henry's favorite, landed in the dirt, gathering dust before she could move to retrieve it. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking now. "Where's Henry?" The tall man pulled a flask from his coat and took a long drink before answering. "Henry ain't comin'." Something cold settled in her bones. He stepped closer, too close, and Sarah caught the smell of sweat and whiskey on his breath. "Told us you were just a problem needed fixing. Said he couldn't marry no woman who talked too much, especially one who started asking questions about his dealings with the railroad boys. She backed away, tripping over her own skirts. "You're lying. Suit yourself." The one with the scar grabbed her from behind. She screamed, kicked, fought like her life depended on it, because it did. But it wasn't enough. They were stronger, meaner, used to hurting things that couldn't fight back. She felt the blow before she saw it coming. When the world stopped spinning, she was on the ground, cheek pressed into dirt and gravel, blood in her mouth. One of them tore the ribbon from her neck. Another kicked her suitcase shut. The third one just watched, eyes blank, like he'd done this before. The tall man leaned down beside her. "You can scream if you want. No one's out here but the coyotes." Then they left. No farewell, no bullet to the head. Just the sound of boots crunching away, fading like the last notes of a funeral hymn. She lay there, in the fading light, throat raw, breath shallow. The sky above her blazed with the last of the sun, cruel in its beauty. She tried to crawl, but her arms shook too hard to hold her weight. Her vision blurred. The wind picked up, dragging dust over her face. Buzzards circled high overhead. Sarah Caldwell, 28 years old, was no longer a bride. She was a body waiting to be buried. Toyani moved like a shadow between rocks, his footsteps absorbed by the sand. The desert had a language of its own, wind over stone, the rasp of lizards through scrub, the distant wail of a hawk too high to see. He understood these signs, but what he smelled now didn't belong. Blood. Fresh, wrong, human. He followed the scent down into a dry ravine, bow in hand, muscles tight. The vultures had found it first, circling, watching, waiting. Then he saw her. A woman, white-skinned, torn dress clinging to a bruised body. Her limbs were crooked like something dropped from the sky. Dried blood streaked her arms, one eye swollen shut. She was trying to move, barely, like a moth twitching on a stone. Toyani paused. The last time he'd helped a settler, his brother had been shot in the back for it. The white men who wore badges had come with handshakes and words of peace, then left with stolen livestock and dead children. He had no reason to trust her, no reason to care. But he didn't leave. He stepped forward, slow and careful, the way you approach a wounded animal that might still bite. Her lips moved. He crouched close, catching the single word she could manage. "Water." He pulled the skin from his hip and touched it to her mouth. She drank, coughed, drank again. Her hands, trembling and blood-caked, clutched at the leather like it was life itself. When he tried to pull it back, she wouldn't let go. He let her have it. When she finally eased back, her one good eye looked up at him, green, wild, afraid and grateful all at once. He examined her wounds, bruised ribs, cut lip, a gash on her scalp. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and crusted with dirt. These were not wounds from falling. These were the marks of men. He said nothing. She didn't ask questions. He wrapped her in his blanket, slid his arms under her broken body, and lifted her from the dirt. She didn't protest. She couldn't. Her head rested against his chest, her breath shallow but steady. He climbed out of the ravine with her in his arms, each step deliberate. The sun dipped low behind them, stretching their shadows long across the earth. This woman, this settler, should have been his enemy. And yet she lay against him, like a child returned from the grave. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But the desert had tried to take her, and the desert would not have her. Not tonight. not while he still had breath in his lungs. Toyani brought her to the cliffs just before moonrise, where the wind carved shelter from stone, and the earth still remembered warmth from the day. He laid her down on a bed of woven yucca leaves and animal skins. The cave was small but dry, hidden from sight, tucked behind a boulder scorched black by time and storms. No white men would find her here. She didn't speak again that night, not in words. Her breaths came shallow, her eyes fluttered open and shut, and once she whimpered something he didn't understand. Some name, maybe. Maybe a plea. He built a fire, quiet and fast, shielding it with his body as the flame took. Then he dipped his fingers into a pouch of salve, mixed from bear grease and crushed willow bark, and pressed it gently against the wounds on her face. She flinched. He paused, waited, continued. When he reached her ribs, she tensed so hard it shook her whole frame. He stopped there. There were some wounds she would have to tell him about herself when she could. By dawn, the swelling in her face had started to ease. She still hadn't moved much, but the fever hadn't set in. That gave him hope. He left her wrapped in the blanket and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp with silence, but the earth gave him what he needed. Roots for poultice, cactus for water, herbs his mother once whispered over when someone was near the edge. He remembered those prayers now, not with words, but through motion. When he returned, she was awake. Not alert, not strong, but watching. Her good eye tracked him as he knelt beside her. She tried to speak, but nothing came out but cracked breath. He held the water skin to her lips again, slower this time. "Easy," he murmured, in his own tongue. "You are not finished." She drank, coughed, swallowed again. Then she looked at him for a long time, as if trying to place him in a world that no longer made sense. Her hand reached for his sleeve, not with desperation, but something close to need. He met her gaze. "You are safe," he said softly, though he doubted she understood the words. "No one will harm you here." She nodded once, just barely. It was all the strength she could give. He stayed beside her as the fire cracked between them, and the wind howled just beyond the stone. Somewhere out in that vast desert, the men who left her to die would be sleeping soundly, dreaming of gold and cattle and lies. But in this small, hidden place, a stranger had made a choice. Toyani hadn't saved her out of duty or pity. He had saved her because something in her eyes told him she would not let the desert take her, and because somewhere deep inside him, against everything he had been taught about white people and war, he knew she was meant to survive. Sarah woke to warmth, not the sun, but the kind that came from something living. A fire crackled low beside her, its glow painting the stone walls in shades of amber and gold. She shifted slightly and winced. Pain bloomed in her side like lightning, but she was still alive, still breathing. The cave was silent except for the soft rustle of wind outside and the faint sound of something being ground, stone against stone. She turned her head and saw him, the man from the ravine. He sat cross-legged near the entrance, grinding herbs with the focus of someone who had done it 100 times before. His skin was coppered by the sun, his hair tied back with leather cord, his posture as still and rooted as the cliffs themselves. He hadn't heard her stir, or maybe he had and simply didn't react. Sarah licked her lips. "Who are you?" Her voice was a rasp, barely more than air. Still he looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he set the stone down and crossed the cave slowly, kneeling beside her. He spoke softly in a language she didn't know, And yet something in his tone, low, calming, soothed her more than any words she might have understood. "I don't know what you're saying," she whispered. He studied her face, then pointed to himself. "Toyani." She blinked, trying to repeat it. "Toyani." A small nod. Not quite a smile, but something passed through his expression. Approval, perhaps. He dipped a cloth into a shallow bowl of warm water and pressed it gently to her forehead. She didn't flinch this time. "Sarah," she said, barely audible. He paused, cloth in hand. "Sarah." She nodded. He wiped the blood from her cheek, the dirt from her jaw. His touch was careful, almost reverent, like he'd seen wounds like hers before, and knew how much they cost. Sarah turned her gaze to the flickering fire. "They left me," she murmured. "They took everything, my case, my money, said he didn't want me anymore." She didn't expect him to answer, didn't expect him to understand. But something in her needed to say it, to speak the pain aloud before it hardened into silence. Toyani didn't ask questions. He didn't offer pity. Instead, he handed her a carved wooden cup, filled with something bitter that burned down her throat but left warmth in its place. Then he sat nearby, just close enough that she could feel his presence. Outside, the wind howled like a distant warning. Inside, Sarah felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the hurt. Not safety, not yet, but something like it, something like shelter. And for the first time since the wagon stopped, she let herself believe she might live. The days passed slowly, like dust drifting through sunlight. Sarah slept, woke, drank the bitter medicine he brewed from roots and bark, then slept again. Her body fought to mend itself, while her mind tried to make sense of a world that had torn open without warning. The bruises faded. The fever broke. The silence between them grew less sharp. Toyani was always near. He moved through the desert like it was an extension of himself, gathering water from hidden springs, hunting rabbits with a bow that never missed, returning with herbs she couldn't name but could feel working through her bones. He spoke little, and when he did, it was in soft words she didn't understand, but there was no need for speech between them anymore. Sarah learned to read his gestures. A nod meant drink, a tilt of the head meant follow. A hand placed gently on her shoulder meant rest. He never touched her beyond what was necessary, never looked at her in the way the men who left her had. There was only steadiness in him, only honor. She tried to stand on the 5th day and nearly collapsed. He caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her with ease, then setting her down with a patience that made her throat tighten. "I used to teach children," she whispered, mostly to herself, "back home, in Virginia. I'd planned a wedding for the spring. I thought he loved me." Toyani said nothing, but he did not leave. She watched him as he lit the fire that evening, the way his hands worked quickly, but with care, like each spark mattered. She wondered what he had lost, what had taught him to move so quietly through a world that broke people without apology. That night, as they shared a meal of rabbit and roasted cactus, Sarah reached out and touched his wrist. He froze, not in fear, but in surprise. "Thank you," she said. He met her eyes and gave the smallest nod, then slowly pulled something from his belt. A small carved figure, shaped like a hawk, with wings spread wide. He placed it in her hand. "Hain," he said. She frowned gently. "What does it mean?" He paused, then placed his hand over his heart. "Story," he said. Then he pointed at her. "You." Sarah clutched the hawk in her hand. The wood was warm, the details so fine she could feel the feathers under her thumb. Her eyes burned. Toyani believed she still had a story to live. And in that moment, surrounded by stone and firelight, Sarah Caldwell understood something deeper than words. She had been left to die. But this man had chosen otherwise. And so had she. Toyani had returned late the night before, his expression darker than she'd seen it. He hadn't said why, only packed quietly, gathering herbs, wrapping meat in cloth, dousing the fire until it hissed into silence. Sarah hadn't asked. She knew. The way he moved, the tension in his jaw. Something was coming. Now they walked through the pale blue light of dawn, slipping through rock formations like ghosts. Sarah leaned on a walking stick he'd carved for her. Each step sent pain blooming up her side, but she didn't complain. Pain meant she was alive. They didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was focused, alert. He scanned every ridge, every bend in the land, listening for a sound he hadn't yet heard but knew would come. And then it did. Far off. Hoofbeats, distant but fast. Men on horses. Toyani stopped, hand in the air. Sarah's heart thudded in her throat. He turned to her, eyes steady. He pointed to a crack in the rock wall nearby, narrow and dark, barely large enough for one person. "Go," he said. She hesitated. "What about you?" But he was already turning away, pulling his bow from his back, stringing it in one fluid motion. The look on his face wasn't fear. It was readiness, resignation. She ducked into the crevice, breath shallow, the stones scraping her shoulders. Through a slit of light, she watched him move, fast and silent, scaling the rocks to find a vantage point. The riders came over the ridge minutes later, 3 of them. Dust trailed behind their horses like smoke. She recognized one, the tall one, the man who'd held her down while the others laughed. His hat tilted low, rifle slung lazily across his back. They stopped near where she'd fallen days before. "Tracks end here," one of them said, spitting into the dirt. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth. Toyani didn't move, but from where she crouched, she could see him. High above, arrow nocked, breath slow. Then one of the men dismounted and began walking toward the rocks, toward her, closer, closer. He stepped over her old bloodstain without even noticing. 10 more steps, and he'd see the opening. Sarah felt her lungs tighten. Her body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. No place to hide. Then came the sound, the whistle of wind, the thump of impact, a scream. The man fell forward, an arrow buried deep in his thigh. Gunfire erupted, wild and echoing. The horses reared. One man shouted curses as he fired blindly into the cliffs. But Toyani was gone from his perch. He moved like smoke, disappearing between stones before they could find the source. Another arrow flew, this time slamming into a man's shoulder, sending him tumbling from his saddle. The tall one turned, yelling orders. But it didn't matter. In under a minute, the survivors fled, bleeding and terrified, leaving behind dust and blood, and the wounded man still writhing in the dirt. Silence returned. Toyani reappeared beside her, breathing hard, bow still in hand. Sarah looked at him, stunned. "You saved me," she whispered. He looked past her, scanning the horizon. "No," he said, "we saved each other." They reached the canyon by nightfall, Toyani leaning heavily on Sarah's shoulder, each breath drawn through clenched teeth. The wound in his side still bled, though she had packed it as he showed her, with crushed juniper and pressure. It wasn't enough. He needed more than what the desert could give. Torchlight flickered along the canyon rim. Signals, warnings, and welcome all in one. Shadows moved above them, silent but watchful. No one approached until they reached the narrow pass. Then came the voice. Toyani. It was old, cracked like dry bark, but carried the weight of authority. Sarah turned to see a man descend from the ledge above. His hair was white, braided with strips of leather and feathers. His eyes caught the firelight like obsidian. Toyani murmured something in his language, low and respectful. The elder answered with a slow nod, then looked directly at Sarah. She stood straighter, despite the ache in her bones. They led her into the camp in silence. Dozens of faces stared as she passed, some curious, many cold. Children were pulled back behind skirts. Men stepped between her and the fire. She felt the weight of 100 years of pain resting on their shoulders. Pain her kind had caused. In the largest lodge, they laid Toyani down. His grandmother appeared from the shadows like smoke and began to work, cutting away the bloodied wrap, muttering prayers under her breath, pressing warm poultices against his skin. Sarah stood at the threshold, unsure if she was allowed to stay. Then the elder spoke again. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. But within minutes, the lodge filled with the council, men and women in long blankets, faces lined by sun and grief. They circled the fire, and one by one, they sat. Toyani bleeds for her, the elder said, motioning toward Sarah. She walks in the blood of our sons. Tell us why. Sarah looked around. There were no allies here, no familiar words, just firelight and faces that bore the weight of ancestors. She stepped forward anyway. My name is Sarah Caldwell, she said. Her voice trembled at first, but she did not lower her gaze. I was promised a life by a man named Henry Wycliffe. Instead, he sent men to kill me, to silence me. A murmur stirred the circle. They left me in the wilderness to die. Toyani found me. He gave me water. He gave me shelter. He gave me a reason to fight. She paused, hands shaking. Henry's been bribing soldiers, selling land he doesn't own, using the railroad to push your people out. He wanted me dead because I knew the truth. The elder watched her in silence, then spoke to the others. They responded in soft, rhythmic Navajo. After a long moment, he turned back. You have two paths, he said. Leave and never return. Or stay and take on the burden of our people. Their pain, their laws, their silence, their storms. Sarah looked to Toyani, his eyes half-lidded but watching her. She didn't hesitate. I will stay. Not as a settler, not as a guest, but as one of them. The desert dawn was quiet, as if the land itself held its breath. Toyani stood beneath a sandstone arch that caught the first golden rays of morning. His wound had healed into a scar now, clean and firm, a mark of survival. He wore a long woven tunic, dyed with ochre and pine soot, and a necklace of bone and turquoise once worn by his grandfather. He looked not like a warrior today, but like something older, something sacred. Sarah approached slowly, her bare feet silent in the dust. Her dress was gone, replaced by a soft doeskin wrap, painted with earth tones that shimmered under the rising sun. Her hair had been braided by Toyani's grandmother that morning, threaded with red thread and tiny beads. Around her neck hung a shell pendant, carved into the shape of a rising sun, his mother's gift, passed down in silence. No one had spoken much since she chose to stay. Not because they disapproved, but because words were no longer necessary. This was a day for meaning. They stood before the council once again. though this time the atmosphere was different. The skepticism had softened. The mistrust had faded, not forgotten, but no longer sharp. An old woman stepped forward, her face a map of years. She held a bowl filled with white cornmeal and ash, and another with river water and sage. She dipped her fingers and touched Sarah's brow, then Toyani's. She spoke in Navajo, voice low and steady, a chant that seemed to carry the rhythm of the wind. Toyani reached out and took Sarah's hands in his. For a moment, she forgot everything. The ravine, the wagon, the bruises, the betrayal. All of it had led her here, to him. "I do not promise you safety," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "But I promise you shelter. I promise you my strength when yours falters. I promise you my truth, and I promise you my breath." Sarah blinked against the heat in her eyes. "I do not promise to forget who I was," she said, "but I promise to become who I must. I promise to walk beside you, not behind, to carry what you carry, to learn, and to never look away from the storm." The elder placed their joined hands in the cornmeal, then raised them toward the sky. "You walk as two," she said in English now, "for Sarah's sake. But the wind will know your name as one." And then she said the name, not Sarah Caldwell, but Shandine, sunlight that returns. The name caught in Sarah's throat. It felt like a home she'd never had. Toyani placed his forehead against hers, not a kiss. Something older than that. A vow made in stillness, in survival, in love. And as the tribe began to sing, Sarah closed her eyes, letting the sound of it wash over her. She was no longer lost. She was no longer dying. She was no longer alone. The wind had shifted that morning, bringing with it the smell of piñon smoke and wild sage. Sarah stood beneath the wooden shade structure Toyani had built with his brothers, her child cradled against her hip, warm and drowsy from the sun. The boy had his father's eyes, dark, watchful, steady as stone, and her smile, soft at the corners, but full of fight. Beyond the ridgeline, a rider approached. The horse kicked up dust as it crossed the wide basin. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Not many strangers came this far into the canyon unless they had reason. But this one, this woman, wore the uncertainty of someone who hadn't found her place yet. A settler, alone. Maybe 20, maybe 30. The kind who still asked permission when she took up space. Sarah met her at the gate. "You're the one they said survived," the woman blurted, words tumbling out like she'd held them too long. "They said you were left for dead, that you married one of them." "I did," Sarah said simply. The woman looked down, embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Sarah said, shifting her son gently as he stirred. "Let me show you something." They walked together to the edge of the bluff, where the land opened wide and unforgiving. A hawk circled overhead. The sun painted the cliffs in gold and rust. And in that stillness, Sarah told her story, not the tidy version, the truth. She spoke of betrayal, of blood on her hands and dust in her mouth, of waking in a cave with cracked lips and shattered ribs, and a man watching her like she mattered, of the fire that burned in her when she chose not to die, of the day she stood before a people who had every reason to turn her away and stayed anyway. She told the woman everything, and when she finished, the wind picked up and rustled the corn she and Toyani had planted together that spring. The woman didn't speak for a while, just stared at the horizon, eyes glassy. "How did you survive it?" she finally asked. Sarah glanced down at her son, now asleep against her shoulder. I didn't survive it, she said softly. I became someone else inside it. The woman nodded slowly. Then Sarah said the thing that mattered. Survival isn't weakness. It's proof. Proof you were worth saving, even when the world told you otherwise. Sometimes the wilderness takes everything, but sometimes, she paused, smiling, it gives something back. The woman's shoulders eased, not quite healed, but no longer broken. And as she turned to go, Sarah watched her ride away, a little straighter in the saddle. The desert, after all, didn't just test people. It remade them. And Sarah, once lost, once forgotten, now stood rooted in the red earth, with a child in her arms, and a name that meant sunlight returned, because she hadn't just survived the desert. She had learned how to live in it.